In 509 BCE, the generally accepted date, the Etruscans were driven out of Rome, and the Roman Republic is said to have been established under the leadership of two consuls, with the checks and balances provided by a senate and various comitia, or assemblies. Although the influences from Etruscans and Greeks remained strong, Rome was now on its own, seeking to establish its own stamp on the peninsula of Italy. The early Romans were largely farmers, living in a small community. The Etruscans, when they conquered, brought a great deal of sophistication to Rome, since they were hydraulic engineers and great temple builders, even though they lacked access to the fine materials that one would find in Greece. By the time the Etruscan rulers were overthrown and forced out, around the traditional date of 509 BCE, the marshy area nestled below and among the Capitoline, Esquiline, and Palatine hills had been drained and filled in, and it became what we call the Roman Forum. The early leaders of this farming community became the nobility, traditionally referred to as the patricians, while those with lesser means and influence became known as plebeians. And these are terms we still use in our society today. In the Roman Forum that grew up in the 6th century BCE and after, the northwest area became the government center. There were two major structures, the comitium, where the assemblies of Rome often met, and the curia, where the senators met. Representation in these assemblies could be determined by tribes, of which there were originally only a couple, but as population increased, the number of tribes expanded to 35. The different popular assemblies were dominated by the wealthier families, who provided the principal support for the military. These assemblies had the power to declare war and peace, to put people to death, and to elect city officials. The major officials were the consuls, two of them, elected every year. They responded to the legislation brought out in the Senate and the assemblies, which functioned much as our own Senate and House of Representatives. Maybe they functioned even better. The number of senators grew to 300 in the Republic, so that the building needed to be large. There were 3 steps running lengthwise on either side of the front door, on which the senators were positioned inside, with a raised area at the back of the hall for the princeps, or the chief of the Senate, to preside and give the first opinion on the matters of state. Senators needed to be at least 25 years old, which seems kind of young to us, but life expectancy was considerably shorter than it is today. They also had to have sufficient property to be of significant standing in the community, a requirement that varied a bit over time. Among the important elected officials was the aedile, Aedile, whose name derives from the word aides, which means a temple or shrine. With the population boom, the aediles had to keep pace and erect all the public buildings necessary. Well, in the Roman Forum, that quickly became quite a task. With the overthrow of the last Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Superbus, believed to have occurred around, as we said, 509 BCE, and the gradual conquest of Rome's Latin and Etruscan enemies in the surrounding countryside, Rome began to grow significantly. The installation of drainage in the Forum and the principal sewer, or what's called the Cloaca Maxima, made a big difference in allowing the construction of the major structures. To honor their most important gods and goddesses, the Romans, of course, erected shrines and temples. The Temple of Saturn was erected in 498 BC to honor not the car, but a Latin fertility divinity who brought the blessings of agriculture to the Roman people. It was located near the Capitoline Hill, which had been an early town center. Like the other buildings of the Forum, once established, the sacred area had to remain where it was, and it could not be moved. That is why the Forum retained its integrity for over 1,000 years, and visitors to it in 400 BCE would be visiting the very same areas where each cult building would still be standing in the 7th century CE. Saturn, as a special protector of the Roman people, looked after their wealth in the state treasury. Another small shrine, or fonum, was built to honor Castor and Pollux, special twin heroes, in fact, to the Roman people, and they were believed to have saved the Roman army in their resistance to the Etruscans and other Latin tribes trying to conquer Rome. Castor and Pollux were sons of Zeus, fierce fighters, horsemen, patrons of the Roman soldiery, and especially of the Roman equites, that group of Roman cavalry, that corps that was drawn from well-connected and valorous families. This group celebrated every July 15th with a dress parade on horseback to honor the twins. Over in the east side of the Forum was the House of the Vestal Virgins. And that was the place where these young ladies who were in service of the cult of Vesta were chosen, sometimes from as young as 6 years of age. They'd served for 30 years, 10 years to learn their trade. I guess they were slow learners. 10 years to practice it, 10 years to be instructors. They were chosen from the best families. They were very well respected and admired in ancient Rome, but they had to remain pure. They could not marry during this period of time. Well, now that we've had a bit of background about the Roman Forum and some of the buildings in there, why don't we come on over to Italy, come with me, and let's take a brief visit to the Forum and some of the buildings in it. Watch. Now the valley nestled among the Palatine, Capitoline, and Esquiline hills became the public nerve center of Rome. For the modern tourist, the Roman Forum seems a hopeless complex of ruins. But to understand it, we can break it up into its different areas to bring it to life. The view over the Forum here allows you to see just about everything, the whole history of downtown Rome, right in front of your eyes. On the northwest side was the great government center with the Curia, or the Senate building of Rome, and originally the Comitium, the place of the assembly, right in front of it. And as you look further away, you see on the south side there was a huge basilica, a covered hall that was built in the Hellenistic period. And further away you can see the ruins of the Temple of Vesta from here, which was the patron goddess, a very important goddess to the Roman people, of hearth and home. And just beyond that, the House of the Vestal Virgins. And even further, way in the background, the Arch of Titus, which was put up after the campaigns in Jerusalem and in Judea in the late 60s. And in front of us here, One of the last monuments of the Forum, the Column of Focus, put up in the 7th century AD, just in front of what was the ancient speaker's platform. So you have all these different periods of time all jumbled up together in an amazing combination. And it just makes you think back and look over the history phase by phase and step by step. The whole history of Rome from the earliest times all the way down to the very last monument in the Forum. In the northwest corner, for example, were government buildings, where the Senate of Rome and the popular assemblies met. The Curia was the Senate, and the Comitium, the Assembly. The Curia was a huge space box where senators conducted the affairs of state. And the final rebuilding of the Curia in 283 CE was preserved by the conversion of the structure into a significant church. In the Middle Ages, when the level of the Forum had risen considerably, a new entry was made higher up in the building, and the thick walls of the lower building were reused for tombs, which were emptied and filled in with concrete in modern times. Over the centuries, foreign missions to Rome might be housed here while waiting to address the Senate, and a government business complex was known as the Forum of Julius Caesar, offering meeting rooms and lovely promenades, reception areas, and even bathrooms, of course, for officials. The people who hung around the northwest part of the Forum were called subrostrani, or those who hung around the rostrum, the speaker's platform. Here in the center of the Forum were given public feasts and were held gladiator fights, death games that might be part of funeral ceremonies for a noted person. Influenced by Greek covered halls, the Romans added basilicas, so-called royal halls, which were like modern malls and featured meeting areas, art shows, and of course shelter from the rain and sun. People who hung around these places to see what was going on were called basilicani. A sundial in the northwest corner of the Forum helped to tell people the time in an age without wristwatches. Starting times were then rather approximate, and come to think of it, starting times for events in Italy now still are approximate. The eastern part of the Roman Forum was not only a religious center for old Latin cults, such as that of Vesta and the Atrium Vestae, or House of the Vestals. It was the headquarters of the main priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, whose task it was to supervise religious rituals, but also to keep a close eye on the Vestal Virgins. His office was called the Regia, located in a small building with several rooms, and it had an irregularly shaped courtyard. It was just northwest of the Atrium Vestae, and in it were many of the sacred objects precious to all Romans. The Regia contained small shrines, what they called in Latin sacraria, dedicated particularly to Mars, the special protector of the Roman people and the troops, and to Ops, O-P-S, Ops Conciva, or Conciva, perhaps the wife of Saturn, and one of those ancient Italic goddesses who protected the harvest. In the open air of this area was a shrine to Mars, and there was a magic lance that allegedly quivered to alert the Roman people to the threat of war. The Roman Forum had several speakers' platforms in it, so that all kinds of events could be held here, from military triumphs to public feasts to special expositions to performances. Many of these things could be held simultaneously. But how did the Roman Forum function on a day-to-day basis? As the city continued to grow in the early years of the Republic, the Forum remained the major meeting place for all of the citizens. Well, as you can imagine, it grew increasingly crowded by the 4th century BCE because the area also served as a marketplace for cattle and fish and vegetables, and still contained a number of sizable private homes belonging to important individuals. The northwest area of the Forum, just east of the Curia and the Velabrum, or sacred spring, the babbling brook that came into the Forum, was a major food shopping area. It even included butcher shops, and nearby there were money lenders and money changers. It's part of the banking area. It is difficult to imagine the bustle and excitement of the Roman Forum with its trials going on in the area of the Comitium, its would-be great orators espousing various subjects, prostitutes hanging around the shops looking for potential clients, and people running into each other to share the latest political or social gossip. There were also elderly citizens coming to take water from the sacred springs, that's where I'd probably be, such as that of Juturna, a popular water nymph said to have magic healing properties for the sick. That was found, just east of the temple of Castor and Pollux. That temple had its own speaker's platform with constantly haranguing orators. There were lots of charlatans too, people ready to tell your fortune, others who were just simply hoping to read documents for you for a fee if you didn't know how to read, or if your eyes were bad, which of course happened at a pretty young age, and they didn't have spectacles. So have a brief look at life inside and outside the Roman Forum. A sacred core of the Forum was the eastern end, all ruined today. It was the Regia, the headquarters of Rome's religious leader, the Pontifex Maximus, whose duties included supervision of the Vestal Virgins, the 6 young girls chosen from Rome's finest families to serve for 30 years under the goddess Vesta. Vesta was the protector of Rome and had her sacred fire and her temple, here rebuilt in the early 20th century based on images from Roman coins of about 200 CE. The Forum was the scene of military triumphs, fantastic shows featuring exotic goods and animals, public speakers, philosophers, and also sick people seeking sacred spring water to cure them. The eastern end of the Forum was quieter and offered escape from the bustling crowds that still show up today. Outside of the Forum, middle class and poor people lived in apartment buildings, up to 5 stories in height, and they shopped in vegetable and spice and meat markets. Water was supplied by aqueducts, and the very best neighborhoods had water brought in from the finest springs located outside the city. Tourists are always either overwhelmed or confused by the ruins of ancient Rome. But Italians have learned to live with ruins in their backyards, parks, and even restaurants, as we discover so often when we travel around Italy. Well, Lana decided that there was an awful lot of reading in this particular lecture that we're doing, so she wanted to come up and see what was going on. So, Lana, do you want to say hello to everybody? You want to say hi? Yeah. I keep Lana with me, but I find that lately I've been getting really addled and confused. Last night I kissed Lana goodnight and I put my wife outside, so it's really... You want to go down? Okay. Well, let's go back to where we are. Well, we've had a look at the Forum, and the Romans were really putting up some wonderful buildings now in the Roman Forum. From the Greeks in the mainland of Greece, on the west coast of Anatolia, what is now Turkey, and in southern Italy, the Etruscans and the Romans learned how to build temples. That's where they got the ideas from. There were three main types of temples that the Greeks built: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. But the latter didn't gain popularity in Rome until the early 1st century BCE. It was mainly Doric and Ionic. The typical Greek temple of the mainland of Greece, in places such as Athens, was this Doric type. The famous temple of Athena the Maiden, or as it is now become better known, the Parthenon in Athens, is a really good example, the most famous example of the Doric style. Let's take a look at the individual parts of a Doric temple, one at a time, to see what distinguishes each style. The Doric column is made up of drums held together by interior rods or poured lead clamps, which join them. The columns are fitted together and they taper slightly from bottom to top. This tapering is called diminution. Diminution, it diminishes, since the column diminishes from bottom to top. The column also is vertically scored on the side for decoration, and this is called fluting. And the Doric column has no base. Continuing upward, we see the capital, or top of the column. It has two parts: a round member called the echinus, E-C-H-I-N-U-S, and a flat plinth called the abacus, A-B-A-C-U-S. Note that the column has no base. That's very important. Above the column is the architrave, a beam that runs along the front and side of the temple. Above that, note the triglyphs, which are vertically grooved slabs, originally in terracotta and originally designed to fit over wooden beams that were coming through the temple. When the temples started to be built in stone in the 7th century BCE in Greece, these attachments were no longer needed, but were kept on for ritual, traditional reasons. It was considered sacrilegious to change too much of the arrangement of the temple. Now, between the triglyphs above the architrave were little slabs inserted to fill in that space. They are known as metopes. M-E-T-O-P-E is one of them. And they were usually carved with sculptures pertaining to the theme of the temple. And above this came the pediment in the front of the temple, with the back of the pediment known as the tympanum, T-Y-M-P-A-N-U-M. So these are the typical parts of a Greek Doric temple. If we look again at the Parthenon, we can see the metopes and also see how the upper part of the temple was painted, rather garishly in fact, so that these buildings were not all simply white, as they are often depicted in movies that you'll see like Gladiator, Sign of the Cross, Cleopatra, or even movies as bad as 2008's really awful movie set in the time of early imperial Rome called Cyclops. Watch if you dare. In the Doric temple, such as the Parthenon, there were two contradictory rules. Every other triglyph had to be placed over the center of each column below it. And yet, each architrave had to end with a triglyph at the corner or at the right angle turn of the temple, so that the triglyphs on the front and the side would touch each other. This is called the angle triglyph problem. How can you make it work? You might want to go back over that, play that again, and so you understand it exactly what I'm saying to you. Because in order to make it work out, the Greeks had to gradually shift the triglyphs that were closer to the corners of the temple a little more over, until by the time the triglyphs were placed at the corner of the temple, they had eaten up enough space to fit right at the corner, do you see? This meant that each triglyph and metope had to be cut to a slightly different size in order to cheat those triglyphs over towards the corner of the temple. Well, the Doric style, being so firm and heavy and sturdy, was often used to make academic buildings, even on campuses as remote as the southwestern United States, such as the University of Arizona. Take a look with us now at the engineering building, for example, of the University of Arizona, constructed during a classical revival period in America in 1918, right after World War I. As we pan over, see how many Doric characteristics you can find. When we get up close to the building, we can see that there are two triglyphs between each column, and the triglyphs are in fact centered over each column. But what happens when we get to the corner of the structure? And this is the big question, the angle triglyph problem. Will the architect of 1919 know that he is supposed to have a triglyph on the end of his building, meeting with another triglyph coming around the corner at right angles? Will he let those two triglyphs fit snugly together at right angles? Let's look. In fact, quite disgracefully, the Tucson architect has failed us. He has left a little bit of metope at the corner, an act which would have evoked disapproval, indeed disgust, from an ancient Greek architect. I have always believed that the architect of the University of Arizona's 1918 building, realizing too late what he had done, planted those mammoth cypress trees that you see right in front of this spot, so that his blatant error could not be seen by those walking by. He may have feared that someone such as each of you would know that he had violated the angle triglyph problem, and his shame would endure through generations. What has made it all the worse is that he did it to the engineering building. Another type of Greek column which the Romans borrowed, beginning in the Middle Republican period, was the Ionic, which had come from Asia Minor, that is, from the west coast of what we now call Turkey. It had similarities to the Doric, but also fundamental differences. Its column had a base, was more slender than the Doric, had flutes with rounded ends, and rose to an echinus that was ornately decorated. There was still a flat but now ornate abacus at the very top of the capital, but in between the echinus and the abacus was a volute member that gave the Ionic its distinctive look, like it's wearing a little voluted hat. This volute could be turned at a 45-degree angle at the corner of the temple to adjust to the right-angle turn of the building. Just as the Doric, the Ionic had an architrave, but it was more decorative and had bands on it, known in Latin as fasciae, F-A-S-C-I-A-E. Above this came a plain frieze course, which was often decorated with sculptures, and which had the advantage of no triglyphs and no metopes, and therefore no angle triglyph problem to worry about, as we had with Doric. The column bases of the Ionic, when they were used in Rome, tended to have a profile that had a projecting, rounded molding called a torus, and a hollowed-out area called a scotia, followed at the bottom by another torus, which projected a little further out. The pediment, tympanum, and framing cornices, or borders, to the pediment were the same as with Doric. The Temple of Portunus in Rome is a perfect example of our Ionic style, dating to the later 2nd century BCE. On the University of Arizona campus, the Forbes building, built in 1915, is in part, a good example of the Ionic style. Now, can you describe the Ionic characteristics of this building as we pan up it? And can you note the main thing that is wrong or missing from this example of Tucson Ionic? The Etruscans preferred to simplify and adapt the Greek styles. Oh, they lacked fine stone, but under Greek influence they developed their own approach to temple building. This came early on to be known as the Tuscan temple type. The Tuscan column looked like a simplified version of the Doric. It could have a base, often simple, and sometimes just a plinth and a simple molding. The columns were often left unfluted. There was an architrave, but no frieze above, nor triglyphs and metopes. One advanced directly up right into the pediment, which was open, no tympanum, and fitted with decorative plaques protecting the upper beam ends. Tuscan temples were often squarish in form, with steps only in the front. They were normally then raised up on a podium rather than featuring steps all around, as a Greek temple had. Tuscan columns, as well as Greek columns, often swelled out slightly at the center, in addition to tapering in as they went up. Originally, this swelling out at the center was done to correct the optical illusion that columns that were actually straight up and down were sagging in the middle. The swelling out of the center of the columns is known as entasis, E-N-T-A-S-I-S, and it might sometimes be exaggerated. You see it in Doric, particularly in early Doric, or we see it in Tuscan column forms, and we also even see it a little bit in Ionic. Because these early temples were largely built of wood and the Tuscan style was largely of wood, it was necessary to provide wide overhangs and an abundant terracotta use for plaques to protect the temple from exposure to weather. Thus, a high and detailed kind of cresting occurs around the pediment. On the Arizona campus, Herring Hall, built in 1901, is an example of what we might call the later Tuscan style. Now, how many typical Tuscan characteristics can you name when you look at Herring Hall? The most famous Tuscan-style temple in ancient Rome was the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill, built about 509 BC by the last Etruscan king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, shortly before he was deposed. It was one of the biggest temples in the entire Mediterranean, and it was intended to put Rome on the map as a major city. Oh, it lacked the beautiful marble of the Greek temples, but it was still enormously impressive. Some of its ruins have recently been incorporated into the Capitoline Museum's complex on Rome's Capitoline Hill, and nearby was found a bronze sculpture of the symbol of Rome, a life-sized she-wolf. Come and have a look at it. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome was the rising power throughout the Mediterranean, beyond Italy. But the glory of Rome was only beginning. There was much more that lay ahead. To imitate the huge temples of the Greek world, the Etruscan rulers of Rome built their own large temple in about 509 BCE on the Capitoline Hill, the Temple of Jupiter. Now enclosed within the newly remodeled Capitoline Museums, its foundations and basement, built in large rectangular blocks, still survive. Here we are on the Capitoline Hill, walking past these statues of the heroes Castor and Pollux, and moving toward the statue of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Here in this Renaissance complex, we're going to go into the Capitoline Museum and see one of the most controversial sculptures in the entire Roman world. In front of the temple complex was found a remarkable ancient bronze, a she-wolf, which for a long time has been thought to date to about 500 BCE and be one of the earliest large bronzes from ancient Rome. Recently, this famous symbol of early Rome, whose alleged founders, Romulus and Remus, were suckled by a she-wolf, has been called into question and has been thought to be possibly of medieval date and not even ancient Roman or Etruscan at all.
Well, the Capitoline she-wolf is going to be controversial, I think. And the most interesting aspect of it is not just whether it's medieval or whether it's 5th century BC. The most interesting aspect, I think, is really where it could be anywhere in between those places, those times. And my inclination is to think that, yeah, it could be later, but before we move something that makes a lot of sense in the 5th century as an archaic Etruscan piece, we need to see some concrete evidence. It's not a huge piece, so at an archaic date, why couldn't it have been cast in a single throw, in a single casting? We just don't know enough about early Etruscan bronze working to say, yes, this fits or this doesn't. And in fact, one of the problems is we don't even have enough to compare it to in terms of just monumental Etruscan sculpture in general. To move it to the medieval period, I think, is just, well, just like downright daffy, I think, at this point.